this essay is one of the most recent things I've written, and it was published in Guernica. So I've cut it back in order to try to stay, to have it be only 20 minutes or so. But so I've cut out a lot of the research. But like Jessica's work, there was a lot of scientific research that went into this essay. So anyway, it's called Water in the Desert. On the way home from the doctor, after the initial diagnosis, Fernando asked me if I was okay. I wasn't. I wanted him to stay home with me, but instead he dropped me off at the house where I tried to grade papers while he went back to work. Later, as we were falling asleep, he said that all afternoon when a customer would say, "Thank you," or "Have a nice day," he'd think, "I have cancer." As a girl, I learned from my mother, who had lost her first husband in the Korean War, to insist sorrow and bury it deep within. So this is not an essay about grief. It is an essay about water. In 1977, when Fernando and I had been married for almost 4 years, we bought a house on the north side of Tucson near the freeway and train tracks. It rained so hard the first winter we lived there that the water rose and began spilling in under the doors. The suddenly lush ivy on the front of our house crawled into the gaps between the window frames and the burnt adobe bricks. The roof began to leak. Fernando used an ice pick to poke holes in each room's ceiling so the water would drain into the holes. Then he used duct tape to fasten a plastic bowl over each leak to catch the rainwater. Bowls were hanging from nearly every ceiling. It was easier than moving all the furniture. In the kitchen, we just let the water drip into a 5-gallon paint bucket. All day, while taking care of our 2 children, I heard the water's rhythmic drip. But sometimes I'd forget to empty and refasten a bowl to the ceiling. One night, the bowl over our bed got so swollen with rain that it tipped over, soaking us and our baby and waking her up. The neighborhood was called Flowing Wells, but we came to call it Seeping Sewers, because when the wind shifted, we could smell the fumes from the ponds at the sewage treatment plant. In the middle of the night, we could hear the trains, and maybe because we had small children, I would wake up worrying about derailments and toxic spills. I was not religious, but I had an apocalyptic imagination. I grew a garden in the backyard because I wanted to be able to feed my family when civilization ended. 1/4 of the yard was planted with corn and pinto beans, the wire fence secured by rebar with upside-down Coors cans glinting in the sun to keep the birds at bay. The grapes tumbled down from the arbor over the vegetable plot. The tomatoes sometimes boiled in their skins before I could pick them. And the neighbors shuttered their windows when they saw me approaching with yet more gigantic zucchinis in my arms. We had peach trees, their limbs so heavy with fruit that they sometimes broke in the summer storms. Because our backyard had once been part of a dairy farm, the soil was dark and loamy. And when the children dug to china, as children do, they found old glass milk bottles. I wasn't very clear on logistics in my apocalyptic imaginings. How would I keep the neighbors out of my gardens, especially since I'd already shared my zucchini and chard? How would I be able to deny them food for their hungry children? And where did I think the water to keep the garden growing would come from? This was the desert. I was the daughter of a geologist. I knew the water was pumped from artesian wells deep beneath the surface of the earth. So this is a quote. "To say that the desert has no water," writes Craig Childs in one of Fernando's favorite books, The Secret Knowledge of Water, "is a tantalizing misstatement. It is believable. But to look over this raven land and know the truth, that there is immeasurable water, tucked and hidden and cared for by bowls of rock, by sudden storms, by artwork chiseled hundreds and hundreds of years ago, is by far a greater pleasure and mystery than to think of it as dry and senseless as wadded newspaper. It is not only drought that makes this a desert, it is all the water that cannot be seen." That's the end of the quote. Whew, I gotta calm down. I had the idea back then that the world would end in fire or water. Now, in the summer of 2015, 2 years after Fernando's death, the Catalina Mountains, which rise above the house where we moved 20 years ago, are on fire. From all of Tucson, you can see the fire at night. The ridge above us glows red, just as it did that first summer when Fernando told me not to worry because the houses between our place and the ridge were worth more than ours. He said, the firemen won't let the rich people's houses burn. They'll put it out before it gets to us. That summer, we watched as helicopters dropped an orange fire retardant that contains fertilizers to help the vegetation grow back. This summer, they're letting it burn. 150 acres so far, practically nothing, when you consider that 1.1 million acres of the American West are on fire, that 5 million acres have already burned in Alaska, and 11 million in Canada. I called my daughter and asked her, if I have to evacuate, what should I save from the house? Dad's ashes, she replied. The copper urn was my first choice too, though it struck me as odd. Not only was Fernando already ashes, but where else would he want his ashes to stay but here on this small plot of desert near the mountains? For love is strong as death, says the Song of Solomon. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. When we got water from the tap, it effervesced in the glass, Fernando told me. He was talking about the water in his parents' house in Mission Manor, a new subdivision on Tucson's south side where his family moved in 1972. And sometimes there would be a rainbow lying on the surface of the water. When we called the builder, he told us it was because it was a new house. He told us to keep the water running to clear out the pipes. When Fernando talked about TCE, or trichloroethylene, I imagined dark plumes spreading underneath the ground. On maps, TCE looks like a big purple feather. From 1952 until the early 80s, workers at Hughes Aircraft and Tucson International Airport used TCE, an industrial solvent, to clean greasy metal parts of airplanes. They later disposed of the spent solvent by pouring it into open pits, directly on the ground, or into culverts, where it eventually percolated into the area's artesian wells. My father had told me that the Tucson Basin was like a big bathtub filled with gravel and surrounded by mountains. When it rained, he said, the water seeped through the gravel to the bottom of the bathtub, where it stayed for eons. Ancient water from the runoff of ancient rains. If you tasted it, it would probably seem brackish. I was 14 when my family first moved to Tucson from Colorado in 1968, and I remember standing at the living room window in my parents' house watching the rain. No one else was home. It was the first time I'd seen the mountains, the monsoons, the heavy summer rains. The winds were hurricane force, I heard on the radio. The lightning was spectacular, and the water was pounding down from the sky, sheeting across the windows. I couldn't see even to the middle of the driveway. I didn't know where my parents and my younger sister were. If they drop a bomb, I thought, the electricity would disappear and the pumps would stop pumping, and suddenly we'd all be out of water. They warned us in school that Tucson was, after all, a town ringed by missiles, number 10 on the list of top targets of our enemies. The desert back then seemed to me an apocalyptic landscape, full of plants with thorns and spikes, cacti that remembered swords. I felt I had landed on an inhospitable planet, one where it could easily hit over 100 degrees day after day for months on end. If there was no water, I knew we'd all be dead in 3 days. In 1972, just before Fernando and I started dating, his family had moved into the tract home in Mission Manor. It lay smack in the middle of the TCE plume, along the flight path to the airport. He had 8 younger brothers and sisters. I remember playing ball with the youngest of them in the front yard. We could hear the planes before we saw them emerge above the roofline. They flew so low that they rattled the windows. Then we saw their white shark underbellies, so enormous, the landing gear, their wide wings. It seemed as if they barely cleared the house, as if we should duck. When we were first married and I moved in with his family, I often dreamed of planes. After his family had lived there for a decade or so, people in the neighborhood started dying. Clear patterns didn't emerge, but sometimes several people in one family would die. Finally, the city tested the water. Some estimates showed that TCE contamination at 1,000 times the federal health standards. They closed wells. There were court cases. Red lines were drawn around the housing developments. Housing developments where 75% of the residents were Hispanic and low income. Once the developments were redlined, it was impossible to sell those houses, so people stayed where they were. The cleanup began, but it was already too late. On Evelina Street alone, near the school Fernando's siblings attended, near Mission Manor Park where they played, and near the swimming pool where they swam in the summers, 34 cancer cases were documented. Several families now have only one surviving member. My beloved spake and said unto me, Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. The fig tree putteth forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grapes give a good smell. You don't have to drink TCE or ingest it. Even if you drank bottled water, TCE would enter your system through your skin when you bathed. When Fernando's brother Eugene first saw a doctor for hemochromatosis, a rare liver condition that can be caused by exposure to chemicals, he told the doctor that he had lived in the area of Tucson that was affected by TCE. The doctor said he'd have to have complete exposure for that to happen, like falling into a vat of chemicals. I did have complete exposure, Eugene said. I bathed in it for decades. Eventually, they found a tumor growing on Eugene's liver. He had a liver transplant. TCE is a volatile organic compound. TCE wants to rise. It wants to be in the air instead of the water. It enters your body when you breathe its vapors in the air or when you drink water contaminated with it. TCE also enters your body through your skin, especially if you have cracks or abrasions or cuts. The first exposure to TCE and the first drink of that water initiates a metabolic process that can result in lymphoma, leukemia, multiple myeloma, testicular and brain cancer, and kidney and liver cancers. TCE is thought to act as an accelerant. In other words, if you have a predisposition to a form of cancer, let's say liver cancer, TCE increases your likelihood of developing that cancer, although it may not manifest for decades. The permissible level of TCE contamination is less than the equivalent of 2.5 teaspoons poured into an Olympic-sized pool. Okay, Fernando used to describe how his grandmother grew rows of corn and hollyhocks in her garden. He and his brothers would chase one another up and down the rows. She'd hang the laundry in the garden and had a wood stove under a ramada and a pot of beans on the stove. She made tortillas there under the ramada on summer evenings when it was still cool, but before the afternoon, on summer mornings when it was still cool, but before the afternoon rains came. Her tortillas were the big ones, so thin they were almost translucent. There in the trees, she hung terracotta pots filled with water. The water was always cool, he said, and tasted of clay. My beloved is gone down into his garden, to the beds of spices, to feed in the gardens, and to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. When the kids were young, Fernando and I used to take them to the air shows out at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, or drive them to the boneyard so we could all look at the old planes that had been retired there. There were thousands of them, with sleek or fat bodies and wings stretched like tails behind them. Some had eyes and mouths painted on them. Some were named after Native Americans, Seminole, Iroquois, Sioux. Others were called Avenger, Voodoo, Banshee, and Demon, as if the names could give them a magic invincibility. There are also the innocuously named C-123s, which had dropped agents orange, blue, purple, pink, green, and white over Vietnam, Laos, and parts of Cambodia during the Vietnam War in order to defoliate the jungle and destroy crops. From 1962 to 1971, during Operation Ranch Hand, the U.S. dropped 20 million gallons of herbicides and defoliates and other dioxins, destroying 5 million acres. The U.S. Air Force even had a Smokey the Bear poster that said, "Only you can prevent forests." I can't believe that, Fernando had said when we read about it. Only you can prevent forests. Still, Fernando loved the Phantom II, its sleek supersonic lines, its technological beauty. He had always fantasized about space travel. I think he wanted to defy gravity and go out into space, an astronaut far above the dear blue sphere of home. Fitting, I now think, that it is called the Boneyard. On acres and acres of dirt fields, planes bake in the sun like bones in the desert. Resting there are planes that had strafed tree lines and planes that had sprayed clouds of rainbow herbicides. Before being retired to the Boneyard, those planes had been washed clean with solvents, and those solvents had seeped into the earth. Because TCE did not cause a cluster of light cancers like childhood leukemia, it was difficult to prove fault and to hold Hughes Aircraft and Tucson International Airport liable. Attorneys settled with insurance companies. If a person was part of the original lawsuit and sick with cancer when the suit was filed, then he or she might have been among the 1,600 residents of a possible 47,000 included in the settlement. On their website, the law firm Barron and Budds touts this lawsuit as among the most important litigation in U.S. history involving personal injuries caused by water pollution. They say that they hired scientists who proved that TCE caused several unusual forms of cancer, especially in children. But the results of those studies about cancer found at almost epidemic levels on the south side of Tucson cannot be revealed, because according to the terms of the settlement, the records of the lawsuit are sealed. This means that none of this evidence can be used to establish precedents in future lawsuits. The lawsuits, therefore, excluded thousands of potential claimants, since such cancers typically do not appear until 10 to 20 years after exposure and may not be limited to one generation. They think 20,000 people at least, but they haven't been keeping count. The liver is a very tender and porous organ. Like a sieve, it filters all the toxins from the blood. Any doctor will tell you that although the liver is the one organ that can regenerate itself, you cannot live without it. When you get a virus like hepatitis C, or you drink too much alcohol, or you're exposed to too many toxins, the liver becomes scarred or fibrous. The sieve gets clogged, and so it can no longer filter the blood effectively. Eventually, you might get cirrhosis or liver cancer. If the tumors from the liver are in the lobes of the liver, they can often be ablated or removed. If the liver still starts to fail, you could be eligible for a transplant. But if, like in Fernando's case, the tumor is in your portal vein, the vein that carries 75% of your blood to your liver, none of those treatments will work, and a transplant is out of the question. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had withdrawn himself and was gone. My soul failed when he spake. I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave me no answer. One of the first dreams I had about Fernando after he died was about water. I dreamed that I was washing his body. I had the huge aluminum bowl, the one that I used to mix masa in for tamales. It was the same bowl that we put near the bedside when someone felt sick. I had filled it with warm, soapy water and dipped the cloth in the water, then wrung it out. I washed his face first, just like I had done in the hospital after his surgery. When he closed his eyes, I washed his forehead and eyelids, and then the rest of his face and his mouth and his neck. I ran the cloth down over his arms, which were still strong in the dream, and his wrists, which had always been as thin as mine. I washed his hands and his chest, still firm from all that hard work, and his stomach, which had more hair than I remembered, but not much at all. In the dream, it was Fernando's bony feet that I saw most clearly. His little sisters used to joke that his feet looked like Jesus's feet, and even in the dream, I remembered that. But what struck me was that I had not paid more attention to his body while he was alive, for it was his body, his physical presence, I missed most. Beloved, thou art fair. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. When Fernando's liver started to fail, his abdomen filled with a fluid called ascites. This made him uncomfortable. It was difficult for him to sit without almost arching his back. When they drained this fluid, he said it was the color of coffee. When he ate, he always had indigestion. He felt weak. He was always tired. He said the chemo pills burned the palm of his hand as soon as they touched it. His skin was dry and papery. The whites of his eyes started to turn yellow. Once I start to turn yellow, he told me, I'll have only a few days, a week. That was when we called his brothers and sisters to say goodbye. They couldn't believe the change. Some had seen him months earlier, some weeks, but he had looked fine. Soon he began to drift and fall asleep. He could no longer talk, though he seemed largely aware of what was going on. Because his liver could no longer metabolize proteins, the ammonia level in his blood was rising and would eventually go to his brain. Perhaps that was why he could no longer talk, why he drifted. The possibility of dementia from the ammonia scared me more than anything, and I knew it scared him too. He no longer remembered how to move his legs. The simplest of things eluded him: how to eat, how to swallow. His legs were as solid as tree trunks, so full of fluid. His kidneys were failing. There was fluid in his lungs. It was hard for him to breathe. I could tell he knew what was happening, but I hoped he was dreaming anyway, seeing the faces of the people he loved most and would have to leave. There were things he wanted to say. He raised his arms, trying to breathe. By night, on my bed, I sought him whom my soul loveth. I sought him, but I found him not. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the roadways. I will seek him whom my soul loveth. Fernando wanted the doctors to document the exposure to TCE for his children who drank the water when they visited their relatives, for me, for our relatives who still live on that side of town. Cancer is no longer unusual in families who have lived on the south side of Tucson, even families like Fernando's with no history of cancer in previous generations. Everyone knows the stories. Still, whenever Fernando would mention TCE to his doctors, they didn't understand what he was talking about. They dismissed his questions. After all, they had their diagnosis, hepatitis C. Exposure to TCE would not change the treatment or the prognosis. Fernando understood this. But, he reasoned, because they were scientists, shouldn't they also consider other variables? Weren't they even curious? But you can't document that which you refuse to see. Or, as they say in Spanish, no hay nadie tan sordo que el que no escucha. There is no one so deaf as he who will not listen. Fernando admired Greg Child's book so much that he kept buying it and giving it to others as a gift. He was born in the desert, and he knew that water was sacred. When he met Childs at a reading and asked him to sign a copy, Childs wrote, "For Fernando, keep this one. I'm serious. Hold it up in the rain. Drink out of it. It is yours." Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Let us get up early to the vineyards. Let us see if the vines flourish, whether the tender grapes appear and the pomegranates bud forth. There I will give thee my love. Thank you.